The air in the arena was thick with the hum of silent intensity, a sharp contrast to the humid, quiet afternoons in Charleston where it all began. 18 months had passed since the afternoon Kendrick West sat across from T. Ashworth, but the world he inhabited now was measured in lux and lumens rather than the soft glow of crystal chandeliers. Above him, a rig of television cameras hovered like silent predatory birds, broadcasting his every blink to a global audience of millions. The 64 squares remained the same, but the stakes had mutated. No longer was he the invisible boy in the break room playing for his dignity. He was the South Carolina stallion, the top-seeded prodigy of the International Junior Championship, and the weight of that title pressed against his shoulders like physical lead. Dear viewers, if you are joining us for the first time, please comment with your city and country below. Kindly subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our daily stories of justice and hidden genius. Now, let's get into the story fully. Kendrick adjusted his blazer, a gift from T, who sat in the front row with a cane gripped in her trembling but proud hands, and looked at the board. His opponent, a stony-faced teenager from Moscow named Victor, had just played a daring novelty in the Grunfeld defense. The commentators in the glass booth whispered into their headsets about Kendrick's first real test of the season. In the elite circuit, brilliance was no longer enough. Consistency was the new currency. The world was no longer asking if he could play. It was demanding to know if he could stay at the top. The silence was absolute, yet Kendrick could hear the frantic rhythm of his own heart. He looked past the board for a fleeting second, catching his mother's eyes. Rosa looked elegant in a navy dress, her hands folded in her lap, her face a mask of quiet strength. She wasn't looking at the pieces. She was looking at him, checking for the boy she knew behind the Grandmaster's stare. Kendrick turned back to the mahogany and maple squares. The lights were hot, making the air feel thin. He realized that the joke T had started in her sitting room had become a destiny he now had to defend daily. He reached out, his fingers hovering for a fraction of a second over his knight. This wasn't about proving a point to a room full of socialites anymore. This was about the lonely, grueling climb of a king who had reached the summit and realized the wind was much colder up here. With a fluid, practiced grace, he slid the piece into a sacrifice that silenced the commentators. The move was a gamble, a declaration that he would not be defined by the safety of his rank. As he pressed the clock, the digital red numbers flickered, a reminder that in this new world, time was the only opponent he couldn't outmaneuver. The game had truly begun, and for the first time, Kendrick felt the terrifying thrill of having everything to lose. The morning light in their new uptown apartment was different than the dusty sunbeams of the mansion's break room. It was sharp, expensive, and filtered through silk. Kendrick sat at a custom-made ebony chess table, his fingers tracing the grain of a board that cost more than his mother used to earn in a year. Across from him sat Grandmaster Aries Thorne, a man whose time T. Ashworth had purchased with the casual ease of buying a new handbag. The lessons were no longer about the joy of discovery or the quiet magic of the library. They were clinical dissections of Grandmaster games, hours of memoizing the Sicilian Najdorf until the patterns felt less like music and more like a heavy suit of armor. Kendrick felt a strange, hollow weight in his chest, a lingering sense that he was a beautiful project being curated rather than a boy playing a game. In the rare moments of silence between Thorne's lectures, he wondered if the prodigy the newspapers raved about was actually him, or just a reflection of T's formidable will. He was a diamond being polished by the best tools money could buy, yet he often found himself missing the scratched boards and the simple, desperate hunger of a boy who played because he had nothing else. Now that he had everything, the game felt dangerously like a debt he was constantly working to repay. From the kitchen, the scent of slow-simmering stew wafted through the air, the one constant in their shifting world. Rosa moved through the modern kitchen with a grace that came from no longer having to scrub the floors beneath her feet. She enjoyed the security, the health insurance, the lack of debt, the way her back didn't ache at night. But when she looked at her son, her heart tightened. She saw him sitting under the glow of the designer lamps, his brow furrowed not with the excitement she remembered, but with the weary precision of an adult. She watched T enter the room, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, eyes darting to the board before they even landed on Kendrick's face. "The tournament in London is only 3 months away, Kendrick," T remarked, her voice carrying the familiar edge of a woman who viewed a stalemate as a personal insult. "We must ensure your endgame is flawless." Rosa caught Kendrick's eye, seeing the fleeting shadow of a child looking for an exit. To the world, and to T, he was a rising star reaching his zenith. To Rosa, he was a 12-year-old boy who hadn't climbed a tree or played a mindless game of tag in months. She feared that in their quest to make him a king on the board, they were sacrificing the boy who lived behind the pieces, turning his natural brilliance into a high-stakes performance that left no room for the simple, unburdened laughter of childhood. The security was a blessing, but as she watched Kendrick nod obediently to his coach, she wondered if the price of their new reality was the very soul of the boy who had started it all. The shadows of the past had a way of lengthening just when the present seemed brightest. It happened on a Tuesday, following a televised interview where Kendrick had spoken with his characteristic, quiet humility about his journey from the servants' quarters to the international stage. The doorbell of their new apartment didn't ring with the polite cadence of the building's concierge. It was a heavy, insistent thud that seemed to vibrate through the very floorboards Rosa had finally learned to walk upon without hesitation. When she opened the door, the color drained from her face, her hand flying to the throat of her dress as if to protect a secret already surrendered. Standing there was Marcus, a man who had been a ghost for a decade, a name Kendrick only knew from the heavy silences that followed his childhood questions. He didn't look like a man seeking redemption. He looked like a man who had finally found a winning ticket. He wore a suit that was a cheap imitation of the one Kendrick wore on camera, and his eyes didn't seek out Rosa's face with warmth, but rather scanned the expensive foyer with a cold, predatory calculation. He held a crumpled newspaper clipping of Kendrick's latest victory as if it were a deed of ownership. The intrusion was swift and clinical. Marcus didn't ask about the years of feverish nights or the struggle of a single mother in Charleston. He spoke of rights, parental management, and legal standing. He talked about the sponsorship deals Kendrick was signed to and the trust funds T. Ashworth had established, his voice oily with a newfound concern for a son he hadn't bothered to name in 10 years. He wasn't there to hold his son. He was there to harvest him. He presented himself as the missing piece of the Prodigy brand. A father come home to ensure his son wasn't being exploited by wealthy strangers, while his own eyes never left the silver tea service on the sideboard. Kendrick stood in the hallway, partially obscured by the shadow of the door frame, watching the stranger who shared his brow and the shape of his hands. He felt no surge of recognition, only a profound sense of tactical alarm. To Kendrick, Marcus wasn't a father. He was an unexpected piece on the board, a rogue queen threatening a carefully constructed defense. The warmth that had begun to settle into their lives felt suddenly fragile, pierced by the realization that his success had acted as a lighthouse, calling not just supporters, but those who sought to anchor themselves to his rising tide. As Marcus began to argue with Rosa about legal guardianship and fair shares, Kendrick realized the game had moved beyond the 64 squares once more. He was no longer just fighting for a trophy or a title. He was now the prize in a high-stakes litigation where the opponent didn't care about the beauty of the move, only the size of the purse. The sanctuary T's wealth had built was no longer a fortress. The gates had been opened by the very fame that was supposed to set him free. Dear viewers, if you have followed the story till here, kindly subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss our daily stories of justice and hidden genius. The air in the grand hall of the Reykjavik Invitational was flavored with the scent of old wood, expensive wool, and a chillingly polite indifference. Unlike the humid, volatile tension of Charleston, this European circuit operated with a quiet, icy exclusivity that Kendrick felt the moment he stepped off the plane. Here, the prejudice wasn't whispered behind lace fans or shouted in moments of aristocratic pique. It was woven into the very fabric of the silence. It was in the way the veteran grandmasters looked through him rather than at him, their eyes tracking the cameras that followed his movement as if he were a strange, temporary artifact of American media rather than a peer. To the elite who gathered in the dimly lit lounges of Iceland, Kendrick was a narrative, a curated story designed to sell chess to a demographic that usually ignored the nuances of the Queen's Gambit. He overheard the word gimmick floating in a sea of French and Russian as he walked toward the refreshment table. They didn't see the thousands of hours spent in the flickering light of a library. They saw a marketing strategy. When Kendrick sat down for his opening match against a seasoned Danish master, his opponent didn't even offer the customary nod of respect. Instead, the man checked his watch with a sigh of visible boredom, as if playing Kendrick were a chore he had to endure for the sake of the tournament's sponsorship visibility. This was the coldness of the elite circuit, a gatekeeping that didn't bar the door, but made the room so freezing that one felt compelled to leave. They spoke in a shorthand of historical references and obscure mid-century theories that felt designed to remind Kendrick he was an outsider to their lineage. Even the journalists' questions were pointed, focusing on his unorthodox background and T. Ashworth's funding rather than the startling accuracy of his endgames. They searched for a fluke in his logic, waiting for the moment the American sensation would stumble and prove their skepticism right. Kendrick felt the isolation acutely, a sharp blade of loneliness that even the presence of his mother and T couldn't dull. In Charleston, he had been a secret. Here, he was a spectacle, and neither felt like being a person. He realized that to these men, chess was a birthright, a noble inheritance passed down through centuries of cold winters. To them, he was an interloper who hadn't paid his dues in the smoky clubs of Moscow or the academies of Berlin. As the first round began, Kendrick stared at the board, the ivory and wood gleaming under the vaulted ceiling. He didn't just need to win the game. He needed to dismantle the idea that he was a guest in their house. He had to play with a precision so undeniable that it would melt the frost of their condescension, forcing them to see that the genius residing in his mind was not a gimmick, but a sovereign power they could no longer afford to ignore. The silence of the tournament hall had always been Kendrick's sanctuary, but today, it felt like a vacuum, pressurized and suffocating. Across the board sat Grandmaster Volkov, a man whose gaze was as unyielding as the iron-gray landscape of the Russian steppes. This was the match Kendrick had spent months preparing for, the tactical summit of the European circuit. Yet, as he reached for his bishop, a frantic movement in the peripheral shadows of the auditorium broke his concentration. He saw his mother, Rosa, standing near the velvet curtains, her face a mask of terror that even the dim theater lighting could not hide. She didn't have to say a word. The empty seat beside her, the one where T. Ashworth had sat with regal defiance for every round, told the story. The news filtered through the back channels of the arena like a poison. A sudden collapse in the lobby, the sharp, cruel strike of a neurological storm that had sidelined the matriarch of their strange, reconstructed family. As Kendrick stared at the complex geometry of the midgame, the pieces began to blur. For 18 months, T had been the engine of his ambition, the woman who had transformed from a tormentor into a fierce, silver-haired guardian. He realized with a sudden, sharp clarity that he hadn't just been playing for titles or to silence the skeptics. He had been playing to keep T's heart beating. Every victory had been a transfusion of life for her, a reason for a lonely widow to remain anchored to a world that had long ago felt empty. His hand trembled over the board. The South Carolina stallion was expected to calculate 30 moves ahead, but all he could calculate was the silence of a hospital room. Volkov cleared his throat, a subtle reminder that the clock was ticking, that the world of professional chess waited for no one's grief. But the board no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a burden. Without T's sharp, expectant eyes watching from the front row, The ivory pieces felt like nothing more than cold stone. He looked at his mother again, seeing her silent plea for him to finish, to honor the woman who had bet everything on his mind. Kendrick took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing his focus back to the 64 squares. He understood now that his brilliance was the thread keeping T connected to the vibrant, competitive pulse of life. To lose now was to let that thread snap. He wasn't just fighting for a checkmate anymore. He was playing a desperate, rhythmic gambit against the encroaching shadows of the hospital ward, moving his pieces with a fierce, frantic devotion, as if each correct move could somehow steady the pulse of the woman who had become the grandmother of his soul. He played through the tears he wouldn't allow to fall, turning his fear into a cold, diamond-hard precision that even Volkov couldn't ignore. The offer arrived not in a hospital waiting room or a quiet library, but in a sterile, glass-walled skyscraper that overlooked the shimmering sprawl of the city. A representative from the Ethelgard Group, a global conglomerate that treated grandmasters like blue-chip stocks, slid a leather-bound folder across a table so polished it looked like deep water. The numbers on the contract were staggering, figures that could secure Rosa's comfort for a lifetime and provide Kendrick with a fleet of world-class grandmasters as personal tutors. But as Kendrick read the fine print, the golden ink seemed to sour. The Ethelgard initiative wasn't just a sponsorship, it was a relocation. It required him to move to an elite academy in Switzerland, a mountain fortress of logic and theory where his life would be scheduled to the second. The representative spoke of unhindered potential and eliminating distractions. But Kendrick knew that distractions was a corporate euphemism for his life. They wanted him to leave the small, warm kitchen where his mother cooked the stew that smelled like home. They wanted him to leave the bedside of a recovering T. Ashworth, whose frail hand still squeezed his in a silent language of mutual survival. To Ethelgard, Kendrick was a high-performance engine that needed a cleaner laboratory. They saw his connection to these two women as friction, emotional drag that slowed down his calculation speed. That evening, Kendrick stood on the balcony of their apartment, the contract feeling like a heavy stone in his pocket. He looked at Rosa, who was humming a soft tune while folding laundry, her face peaceful for the first time in a decade. She had already told him she would support whatever he chose, but he saw the shadow of grief in her eyes at the mere thought of the distance. If he took the contract, he would become the greatest player of his generation, a legend forged in the silence of the Alps. He would have the greatness T had always envisioned for him. But as he looked at the 64 squares of the travel set on the coffee table, he realized that a king without his court was just a lonely piece of wood. The temptation was a siren song of safety and prestige, promising to remove the irregularities of his upbringing. Yet, Kendrick understood a truth the corporate lawyers never would. His brilliance didn't come from the absence of his family, but from the strength of it. His moves were sharp because he played for his mother's pride. His endgames were resilient because he had learned tenacity from T's stubborn spirit. To choose the academy would be to choose a world of pure logic, but it would mean sacrificing the heart that fueled his genius. He was being asked to trade home for a throne, and for the first time in his life, the most logical move felt like a profound betrayal of the board itself. He realized that if he lost the people who saw him as Kendrick, no amount of Grandmaster titles would ever make him feel like he had won. The board, once a landscape of infinite clarity and light, began to darken with the shadows of things that had nothing to do with chess. As the preliminary rounds of the next major tournament commenced, Kendrick sat before the pieces and felt a cold, paralyzing fog settle over his mind. For the first time in his life, he was seeing ghosts. When he looked at a simple pawn structure, he didn't see the mathematical elegance of a breakthrough. Instead, he saw the jagged lines of the legal injunction his father had filed. When he calculated a knight maneuver, the rhythmic ticking of the chess clock began to sound like the steady, clinical beep of the heart monitor in T's intensive care unit. The fluid, joyful style that had made him a sensation, the mysterious alchemy that allowed him to find beauty in chaos, had vanished, replaced by a rigid, frantic caution. He was playing scared. Every move was made not to win, but to avoid losing, a psychological trap that turned his genius into a cage. He became obsessed with safety, triple-checking every square for a threat that wasn't there, terrified that a single mistake on the board would somehow mirror a failure in his real life. If he lost this game, would his father's lawyers use it as proof that his current environment was detrimental? If he stumbled, would the Ethelgard group rescind their support, leaving his mother without the security he had promised her? The pressure manifested as a physical weight, making the wooden pieces feel like they were made of iron. In a match against a lower-seeded player he would have dismantled months ago, Kendrick found himself drifting into a passive, defensive crouch. He missed a simple tactical shot, a fork that would have ended the game, because his mind was busy rehearsing the arguments Marcus had shouted in their foyer. The South Carolina stallion was faltering, his movements stiff and mechanical. He was no longer playing the board. He was playing the consequences. By the time the mid-game arrived, the commentators were speaking in hushed, confused tones about his unprecedented collapse. To Kendrick, the 64 squares had become a minefield where every step felt like a betrayal of the people counting on him. He looked down at his hands and realized they were shaking, not from the cold of the arena, but from the realization that he had lost the one thing that had always saved him: the ability to dream within the game. The joy was gone, buried under the rubble of lawsuits and medical charts, leaving behind a boy who was suddenly, devastatingly aware of how much he had to lose. As he resigned his first game of the season, the silence that followed wasn't the respectful hush of a masterclass, but the hollow sound of a prodigy who had forgotten how to breathe. The hospital room smelled of antiseptic and artificial lilies, a sharp, clinical reality that felt a world away from the grand stages of Europe. T. Ashworth looked smaller than Kendrick remembered, her regal frame swallowed by the white expanse of the adjustable bed. The fierce light in her eyes had been dimmed by the stroke, and her right side remained a silent passenger to her will. Kendrick sat by her side, his hands folded, feeling the heavy residue of his recent losses like a layer of dust on his soul. He didn't speak of the ghosts on the board or the crushing weight of the Ethelgard contract. He simply sat in the shadow of the woman who had become his unlikely North Star. With a slow, laborious effort, T lifted her left hand and pointed toward the window, where a small magnetic chest set sat on the plastic bedside table. Kendrick moved it to her lap, his heart aching at the sight of her trembling fingers. There was no audience, no television cameras, and no Grandmaster analysts waiting to dissect their moves. In the quiet of the ward, they began a silent game. Kendrick played with his usual caution, his mind still clouded by the scared defensive patterns that had plagued his professional matches. Then, it happened. T moved her queen into a position of blatant vulnerability, a tactical blunder so elementary it was almost shocking. Kendrick paused, his analytical mind immediately identifying the error. It was the exact mistake she had made 18 months ago in her sitting room, the one he had gently corrected when the world first learned his name. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, the fog in her eyes cleared, replaced by a mischievous, knowing glint. She hadn't made the move because her mind was failing. She had made it because his was. She was reminding him of the mysterious alchemy they had shared. By mimicking her old self, she was calling him back to the boy who played for the beauty of the pattern, not the safety of the result. In that silent exchange, the hospital walls seemed to dissolve. Kendrick realized that chess wasn't a job, a brand, or a legal shield. It was a conversation between two souls who had found each other across a vast social divide. It was a language of joy, resilience, and connection. The tension in Kendrick's shoulders finally broke, a year's worth of artificial pressure evaporating in the sterile air. He didn't take her queen. Instead, he moved a knight to a square that invited a complex, beautiful counterplay, a move that prioritized the dance over the kill. A small, lopsided smile touched T's lips. He was no longer seeing ghosts. He was seeing the light again. He remembered that the board wasn't a place to hide from his life, but the place where he was most alive. As they continued their silent, imperfect game, Kendrick felt the 64 squares return to him, not as a prison of expectations, but as a sanctuary of pure, unburdened possibility. He was home. The mahogany-paneled conference room felt like a giant chessboard, cold and calculated, designed to intimidate anyone who didn't belong to the world of billable hours and high-stakes litigation. Marcus sat at the head of the table, flanked by two lawyers whose expensive suits seemed to be made of the same gray stone as their expressions. On the other side sat Kendrick, appearing small but strikingly composed, with Rosa and T, now upright in a wheelchair, her eyes flashing with their old fire, standing as his silent flank. Marcus leaned forward, his voice a practiced blend of false paternal concern and entitlement, speaking of restructuring the brand and taking control of the asset. To Marcus, Kendrick was no longer a son, but a series of future earnings that needed to be harvested. Kendrick listened in a silence so profound it seemed to pull the oxygen from the room. He didn't interrupt, didn't show anger, and didn't let his hands shake. He watched his father the way he watched a desperate opponent trying to bluff through a losing endgame. When the lawyers finally pushed a stack of documents toward him, papers designed to strip Rosa of her guardianship and hand the management of his career to Marcus, Kendrick didn't look at the signatures. He looked at the logic. In the Sicilian defense, Kendrick began, his voice quiet but resonant, there is a moment where a player becomes so obsessed with capturing a poisoned pawn that they fail to see their own king is completely exposed. He looked Marcus directly in the eye, a gaze that held the weight of 10 years of absence. You've spent weeks calculating the value of the sponsorships, the Ethelgard contract, and the trust funds. But you missed the most basic rule of the opening. Kendrick reached into his bag and pulled out a single sheet of paper, not a chess diagram, but a legal brief he had spent nights studying with T's own attorneys. I have already signed a declaration of intent to remain under my mother's sole guardianship until I am 18, verified by the state and backed by a mountain of evidence regarding your abandonment. Furthermore, he continued, his tone as clinical as a grandmaster announcing a forced mate in 5. The Ethelgard contract you were hoping to skim from? I declined it this morning. There is no asset to manage, Marcus. There is only me. The room went deathly still. The lawyers traded a panicked glance. The poisoned pawn had been a trap. Kendrick stood up, the chair scraping softly against the carpet. You came here to play a game for money, he said, but I've been playing a game for my life. I am not a piece on your board, and I am certainly not a pawn in your bank account. With the same calm precision he used to press a chess clock, Kendrick pushed the unsigned documents back across the table. He had analyzed every move Marcus could make before the man had even walked into the room. It was a total, bloodless checkmate. As Kendrick walked out, followed by the 2 women who truly loved him, he didn't look back. He had finally won the most important match of his life, the right to belong to himself. The final match of the season didn't end with a thunderous ovation or a frantic flash of cameras. When the reigning champion finally tipped his king in resignation, the sound was nothing more than a soft click of wood against wood, a quiet surrender in a room filled with the hushed reverence of those who had witnessed something transcendent. Kendrick West did not jump to his feet or pump his fist in the air. He simply sat for a moment, letting the stillness of the room wash over him. He was a champion now, the titles and the trophies officially his. But the victory felt different than he had once imagined. It didn't feel like a conquest. It felt like a homecoming. Weeks later, the Atlantic breeze carried the scent of salt and jasmine through the open windows of a sprawling house in Charleston, not the porcelain prison of T's past, but a home filled with the warmth of lived-in spaces. The South Carolina stallion had returned, But the boy who walked through the door was no longer a prodigy defined by the expectations of others. He was a young man who had navigated the shark-infested waters of greed and elitism and emerged with his soul intact. He knew his value now, and it wasn't measured in ELO ratings or the weight of a gold medal. In the sun-drenched parlor, a chess set was laid out on a low table, but the pieces stood in their starting positions, unhurried. T sat in her favorite armchair, her recovery marked by the steady way she held her teacup and the sharp, affectionate wit that had returned to her voice. Rosa sat beside her, no longer a shadow in the hallway, but the anchor of the household, her laughter ringing out as she shared a story from the market. They were a strange, beautiful assembly of broken pieces that had found a way to fit together, creating a mosaic more resilient than the original. Kendrick leaned against the door frame, watching them. He thought of the mountain academies in Switzerland and the cold, hollow prestige he had walked away from. He looked at the board, then back at the two women who had fought for him, cried for him, and taught him that a king is only as strong as the heart behind the move. He realized then that his greatest achievement wasn't the masterclass he had played in Europe or the checkmate that had silenced his father. It was this, the quiet, indestructible peace of a Tuesday afternoon. He understood that while he would always love the game, the 64 squares were just a mirror for the life he lived outside of them. As he walked over to join them, he felt a profound sense of completion. He saw the way the light caught the silver in T's hair and the pride in his mother's eyes, and he smiled. The most beautiful pattern wasn't on the board, but the faces of the family he chose.